The wind tore at Alara's threadbare cloak, a relentless, unseen hand shoving her across the barren land. The snow, a cruel deception of purity, bit at her exposed skin, melting into icy rivulets on her face. Each step was a prayer, a desperate gamble against the vast, indifferent emptiness stretching out beneath the bruised sky. Her breath plumed in ragged gasps, stolen from lungs that burned with exertion and fear. The cabin had been a rumor whispered by a sympathetic stable hand, a solitary dwelling miles from the town where she'd arrived, naive and hopeful, only to be met with a brutal mockery of marriage. He had bought her, and in his eyes, possession meant the right to break. The memory of his hands, his voice, was a phantom chill colder than the wind. She had fled under the cover of night, leaving behind the broken glass of her expectations and the raw bruises on her skin. Now only instinct propelled her forward, a primal need for distance, for safety. The cabin, when it finally appeared, was a smudge against the horizon, a dark, silent promise of shelter, or perhaps a different kind of danger. It squatted low and sturdy against the elements, smoke curling thinly from its stone chimney, a sign of life, and therefore potential peril. Her legs screamed for rest, but a surge of adrenaline pushed her onward. Reaching the rough-hewn door felt like crossing an ocean. She raised a trembling hand, hesitated, then rapped feebly. The sound was swallowed by the wind. She knocked again, harder this time, the urgency a frantic drumbeat against her ribs. The door creaked open, revealing not a monstrous figure, but a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, framed by the firelight within. His face was obscured by shadow and a thick beard, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, just watched her, a silent sentinel. She was a woman alone, appearing out of a blizzard, a sight that must have seemed impossible, suspicious. Fear, a constant companion, coiled tighter in her gut. But the cold was a tangible, immediate threat, and the man, whatever his nature, possessed warmth and shelter. "Please," she whispered, her voice raw and thin, barely audible above the wind's howl. "I have nowhere to go." He remained silent for a long moment, his gaze steady, assessing. She felt utterly exposed, her vulnerability laid bare like a wound. The air crackled with unspoken questions, with the heavy weight of his decision. Then, slowly, he stepped aside, the movement minimal, almost reluctant. The gesture was stark, unadorned, offering nothing but the space within. It wasn't an invitation, more like an allowing. Stepping over the threshold was like entering a different world. The small cabin was sparsely furnished but clean, smelling faintly of wood smoke and dried herbs. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows that softened the harsh lines of the room. The warmth enveloped her like a physical embrace, thawing the ice in her veins, but doing little to melt the fear that still gripped her heart. The man closed the door with a quiet thud that sealed them inside, away from the storm, together in the confined space. He turned, his eyes, when they caught the firelight, were dark and deep, unreadable pools. He didn't ask her name, or where she came from, or why she was there. His silence was unnerving, profound. He simply gestured towards a stool near the fire. "Sit," he said, his voice low and rumbling, like stones shifting underground. It was the first word he'd spoken, devoid of warmth, yet not unkind. It was simply a direction. She obeyed numbly, her legs giving way as she sank onto the stool, holding her chattering teeth together. She watched him through narrowed eyes, every muscle tensed, ready to spring, though she had nowhere to run inside these walls. He moved with a quiet efficiency, adding a log to the fire, settling back into a chair across the room, the distance between them a deliberate choice. He didn't offer food, or drink, or comfort. He offered space and silence. And in that silence, surrounded by the roar of the storm outside and the crackle of the fire within, Alara began the slow, painful process of simply surviving. The first few days were a study in quiet, agonizing tension. Alara huddled by the fire, wrapped in a coarse wool blanket. The man, she didn't know his name, and he hadn't offered it, had placed on the stool while she slept, curled in a heap on the floor. She ate the plain food he provided, stew, hard bread, sometimes dried meat, when he set it down a safe distance away. She watched him constantly from the corner of her eye, cataloging his movements, his habits. He spent most of his time working outside, even in the biting cold, chopping wood, tending to unseen tasks. When inside, he sat by the fire, mending tools, reading a worn book by the firelight, or simply staring into the flames. He rarely looked at her directly. He never spoke to her, beyond the initial word, unless it was a necessary, functional command, like wood or water, gesturing towards the appropriate task or supply. His silence was a shield, a mystery. Was it caution, distrust, indifference, or something else? She couldn't tell. Her own voice remained locked away, trapped by fear and the long habit of being silenced. She felt like a ghost in his home, a temporary intrusion. Yet he did not ask her to leave. He did not threaten her. He did not touch her. The absence of these things was a balm, a slow unfolding of a fragile sense of safety she hadn't known existed. Her body slowly began to recover from the harsh journey. The bruises faded to sickly yellow and then vanished. The perpetual ache in her muscles subsided. But the wounds inside were deeper, less visible. Sleep was a battlefield of nightmares, of hands reaching for her, of cruel words echoing in the darkness. She would wake with a gasp, heart pounding, only to find the man still sitting by the fire, a silent, solid presence in the shadows. He never commented on her distress. One morning, needing water, she cautiously approached the bucket by the door. As she reached for the ladle, her hand trembled. The man, seated across the room, didn't move, but she felt the weight of his unspoken observation. She managed to scoop the water, her movements clumsy, spilling some onto the floor. She froze, expecting a sharp word, a look of displeasure. He simply continued mending a strap of leather. The absence of reprimand was profound. Later that day, spurred by a desperate need to prove she wasn't a burden, or perhaps just a need for something to do, she picked up the worn broom leaning against the wall and began to sweep the dirt floor. The man watched her for a moment, then returned to his task. He didn't praise her or thank her, but he didn't stop her either. It was a small act, but it felt significant. A tentative step towards shared space, towards a fragile, unacknowledged understanding. She noticed the careful way he handled his few possessions, the quiet respect he seemed to have for the land outside his door, the efficiency of his movements. He was a man of routine, of solitude, of the wilderness. Not the sort of man who sought control, but one who had found peace in his own company, beholden to nothing but the seasons. Slowly, observation began to chip away at her fear. He wasn't kind in any overt way, but his actions, his deliberate distance, his lack of demands spoke volumes. He offered sanctuary without expectation. It was a silent negotiation, a slow dance of presence and space. She started leaving her small pile of blankets neater in the morning. She began anticipating the need for water or wood, performing the tasks before he had to gesture. Small, silent offerings of competence, of effort. He never acknowledged them directly, but the subtle shift in the atmosphere, the fainter edge of his initial wariness, was perceptible. She was no longer just a creature seeking refuge from the storm. She was becoming a quiet, functional part of the rhythm of his solitary life. The harsh exterior of the cabin, of the man, seemed to reflect the harshness of the world outside, but within its walls, a fragile seed of something new was beginning to sprout. A tentative trust rooted in shared silence and the simple dignity of mutual existence. As the days turned into weeks, the biting cold tightened its grip on the landscape. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the world in a thick, unforgiving white. They were truly isolated now, the cabin a small island in a sea of snow. The need for shared survival intensified, subtly altering the dynamic between them. Alara found herself working alongside the man more often, her initial fear replaced by a quiet determination to contribute. She learned to stack wood efficiently, to prepare simple meals from their dwindling stores, to mend their worn clothes with needle and thread. He still spoke little, but his silence felt less like judgment and more like his natural state. He watched her as she worked, his dark eyes missing nothing, but there was no longer the same tension in his gaze. Sometimes, she caught him looking at her not with suspicion, but with a quiet, assessing regard that felt almost neutral. It was a vast improvement over the predatory stares she had known. One afternoon, while she was struggling to split a stubborn piece of kindling with a small axe, he appeared beside her. He didn't take the axe from her, didn't offer unsolicited advice. Instead, he knelt beside the woodpile and, with a few swift, economical movements, showed her the proper angle, the precise spot to strike. He didn't touch her, didn't speak the instructions, but his hands guided hers on the tool, a brief, impersonal contact that nonetheless sent a jolt through her. It was the first physical guidance he had offered, a practical demonstration of competence that bypassed words entirely. He stood up just as silently as he'd arrived, leaving her to practice. And she did, feeling a surge of quiet satisfaction as the wood finally split clean. The external threat of winter was a constant pressure, forcing them to rely on their skills, on their ability to work together. The wind howled around the cabin, rattling the window panes like a hungry beast. The fire became the heart of their world, a source of warmth, light, and a shared focal point in the long, dark evenings. They would sit by the hearth, he with his book or tools, she mending or simply watching the flames, the silence between them no longer heavy with fear, but filled with the ambient sounds of the cabin, the crackling fire, the relentless wind, the soft rhythm of their breathing. The fear of pursuit still lingered in the back of Alara's mind, a cold knot of anxiety. She never spoke of her past, but she wondered if he suspected. His stoicism offered no clues. One evening, a sound outside, a distant cry, perhaps the wind, perhaps something else, made her flinch violently. She wrapped her arms around herself, her body trembling. The man looked up from his book, his gaze meeting hers across the fire. For a fraction of a second, the carefully constructed wall around him seemed to soften. There was a flicker of understanding, recognition. He didn't ask what was wrong. He simply rose, went to the door, and stood there for a long moment, listening. Then he turned and went back to his seat. The silent vigil, the unspoken readiness to confront whatever might be out there, was more protective than any spoken promise could have been. It was an acknowledgement of her fear, and a quiet, unasked-for shield. The silence was no longer just an absence of noise. It had become a form of communication, a language built on observation, shared tasks, and subtle gestures of care, protection. She wasn't sure of the word, but the feeling was undeniable. The harsh environment had not only tested their survival but had forged a fragile, resilient connection between two solitary souls. A connection built not on shared history or declared intentions, but on the simple, profound act of weathering the storm together. The storm raged for 3 days, a white maelstrom that buried the cabin almost to its eaves. They were trapped, the world outside an impassable, freezing void. Survival became the only imperative, stripping away any remaining artifice. During the height of the blizzard, the chimney became partially blocked with snow, filling the cabin with acrid smoke. Without a word, the man pulled on his heaviest coat and went outside into the terrifying white maelstrom to clear it. Alara watched him go, her heart in her throat, the fear for him a sudden, sharp sensation she hadn't expected. She realized, with a jolt, that his survival was now inextricably linked to her own. When he returned, covered in snow and shivering, she didn't hesitate. She helped him off with his coat, stoked the fire, and pressed a mug of hot water into his hands. The simple act of care felt natural, necessary. He met her eyes as he took the mug, a flicker of something unreadable passing between them. The shared ordeal of the storm, the implicit reliance on one another for the basic necessities of heat and shelter, had deepened the unspoken bond. When the storm finally broke, leaving behind a world transformed into a dazzling, silent expanse of white, the cabin felt different. It was still small, still spare, but it no longer felt like a temporary refuge or a cage. felt like. There's the fear of her past, while still a shadow, no longer consumed her. The harsh journey, the brutal winter, the silent man, they had not broken her, but forged her. She had arrived a trembling, broken thing, fleeing a past that sought to define her. She had learned to find strength not in escape, but in standing firm, in contributing, in simply being. The man, Caleb, she had learned his name during a brief, practical exchange about supplies, remained a man of few words, but his presence was a quiet anchor. He had provided not just shelter, but the space and silence she needed to rebuild herself, piece by agonizing piece. He hadn't tried to fix her, hadn't demanded anything from her. He had simply allowed her to exist, to work, to heal in her own time. And in doing so, he had offered a refuge deeper than any cabin walls, the refuge of being seen, accepted without judgment or expectation. One clear, cold morning, Alara stood by the cabin door, watching the sun glint off the snow-covered peaks. The future was uncertain, a blank canvas like the landscape before her. The threat of her former life still existed, a distant possibility. But it no longer held the same power. She was no longer the woman who had arrived, shivering and terrified. The harshness of the land, the quiet strength of the man beside her, the resilience she had found within herself, these had reshaped her. Caleb stood a few feet away, sharpening an axe, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't look at her, but she felt his presence, solid and dependable. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was not alone. The path ahead would be difficult, marked by the challenges of the land and the echoes of the past. But she would face it not with despair, but with the quiet determination she had learned in this isolated place. The refuge wasn't just the cabin. It was the resilience she had cultivated, the quiet dignity she had reclaimed, and the unspoken partnership forged in the crucible of shared hardship. It was a fragile hope, born of ice and fire, silence and strength, blooming improbably in the vast, indifferent wilderness.